So yes, you got hooked by this tribalism part and drama while you were like familiarizing yourself with the subject, but at some point you get tired of all of that, all of the fanfare, and you go to a place of some, roughly speaking, quiet contemplation, right? Trying to figure out what is actually happening, how it's happening, and most importantly, why it's happening. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I shall describe what I would call a dilemma of the researcher, okay? And we'll talk about people's motivations, the problem of free will, and things like that. So, I claim that once you've studied some subject, it actually doesn't really matter which subject that is, you usually arrive at some sort of confrontation, some sort of conflict, because it is very easy to perceive any situation through the lenses of drama, if you wish. So when we have, roughly speaking, one thing versus the other thing, all right? At least it's much more fun to study any new topic in this way. To give you an example, Adam Smith, when he was writing his books about, like, you know, the free market and stuff, was constantly using mercantilists to foreshadow his own ideas. So he was basically virtually debating this vague collective of mercantilists, even though no actual collective named mercantilists existed, but he kind of had to use something to foreshadow his own ideas, right? And actually, you know, that his own ideas are actually, at least the good ones, are only those that he's stolen from French mercantilists, right? Not mercantilists, physiocrats, right? French physiocrats. So yeah, so you need some conflict, some drama in order to, like, to gain some motion, right? To get some excitement about the problem, about the situation, etc., etc. So then, after that, you have a choice between basically two stances that you can take. And this is what this video is about. This is the dilemma, all right? So it can be described roughly as descriptions versus prescriptions. Or, for example, study versus condemnation. Or explaining versus blaming, right? Something like that. See what I did here? I also introduced a conflict, right, into this problem. So we have one thing versus another thing, a confrontation, if you wish. So yeah, these are two options, I would claim. So basically, are you a researcher? That's the first option. Or are you an activist? That's the second option. That's the question. Are you involved in trying to understand a phenomenon? Then you're a researcher. Or are you involved in trying to change it? Then you're an activist, a propagandist, if you wish. So let's consider some examples of the second approach first. So we have, for example, some might say, well, evil mainstream science. Why can't all these evil mainstream scientists see the light? You know, we have our own great alternative theory, and like, but they ignore it for some reason, etc., etc. So we become an activist in favor of this theory, and we kind of try to blame the evil mainstream scientists, etc. Or you might say, well, evil communists, why can't they see the light? I mean, obviously the free market is so much better, etc., etc., but they for some reason oppose it, right? So they're either what, stupid or malevolent, right? So basically it places the blame on the people, right? On the people you oppose, the people that support another idea, not the one that you support. So it makes you a sort of like a forum warrior, or basically an activist, a propagandist, all right? What is the first approach then? So this is the prescriptive, like the activist, the propagandist, the blaming, the condemnation style. What's the other style? The researcher, the like more calm and collected, descriptive stance. Well, it is when you're actually acknowledging that, for example, communists or mainstream scientists are winning, all right? That's, you just acknowledge this as a fact, and then you simply try to understand why that is the case. So you study the situation, you try to understand what's where, why do people support this idea and not the other, etc., etc. So it is seemingly actually a more respectful approach, you might say, but actually with a thick asterisk, and it's so thick to the point of being completely disrespectful. So let me clarify that. Why is it disrespectful? Well, because it's dehumanizing ultimately. So, you know, you basically perceive the people who support the idea that you don't support, for example, as biorobots, as automatons, you know. So they're not evil or stupid because everything they do, like, they have no free will anyway. Like, it's all automatic, you know. So in the second approach, we treat our opponents as equals, right? In this activism approach, we like ascribe certain free will to them. We consider that they are able to make a choice. They're just making the wrong choice according to us, right? Whereas in this first approach, where we just describe and study them almost like lab rats, like again, we treat them like biorobots essentially. We study them like ants on an ant farm or something like that, right? You know, there's a saying in French, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, right? Which means like to understand everything means to forgive everything. So yeah, this is the approach. Like you try to understand and thus forgive. So you don't blame them. Actually, you're just saying, well, they're just, you know, like machines. Like there's nothing to blame. Like they're not evil. They're just acting deterministically, right? It's like you're not angry at a lion, for example, when it attacks you. It's just the way lions work, you know. You're not angry at communists that they're doing what they're doing because, well, they don't have any free will anyway. So why would you be angry at them? You just study them, like you study again ants or rats or whatever. So an example of the second approach would be, for example, like again, like Electric Universe blog post condemning like stupid mainstream science, right? Whereas an example of the first approach would be, for example, like a book by Andrew Pickering or Bruno Latour or any other modern sociologist of science who actually goes there into these labs and study how science actually works, right? Again, studying the scientists as if they were like almost like natural phenomenon, you know, something like that, like will-less automatons again. So my claim would be that the second approach, even though it's captivating, as it's full of emotion and, you know, this tribalism where we like pick a side and like root for it, etc., it is kind of superficial, right? So it is somewhat addictive, of course. It's like a drug because, again, it's very intense in terms of emotions. But ultimately, the researcher, I would claim, usually drifts towards this first approach, eventually, over time. So, yes, you got hooked by this tribalism part and drama while you were like familiarizing yourself with the subject, but at some point you get tired of all of that, all of the fanfare, and you go to a place of some, roughly speaking, quiet contemplation, right? Trying to figure out what is actually happening, how it's happening, and most importantly, why it's happening in the way it does. So, you start treating people like will-less robots at some point, right? So it's this behaviorism approach, the stimulus and reaction. And yeah, we probably should talk about the free will somewhere here. So can, for example, consciousness break this deterministic loop of stimuli and reactions? So if you've ever been in any position of power, had to make any decision actually whatsoever, you know how constrained you are in these situations, right? You are basically, like to use the analogy from one of my previous videos about logic, you are moving in a maze, basically. You are very limited, right? And like, basically the decision is already made, right? You're not really making a decision. You are so determined in your decision. You are so constrained by these external factors, like the other interests around you of all the concerned parties, etc., etc. So yeah, you might say it's a good argument against free will, and it kind of is, I would say. So even if you're like an ascet, like a sage somewhere in the mountains in a cave, you're still very constrained, for example, by your genetic programming, right? So your perceptions are to a large degree preset, just like as I've said in my video E.th.ph, see the link in the description, where I compare the genetic code to the, you know, code of the matrix. Like your world is actually written in your genes, if you wish. It is the actual code of the matrix, right? It is the actual simulation your universe is running, so to speak. Also, it's determined by your upbringing and things like that. And even your reactions, like, they are intellectual to a large degree, and even these intellectual things determine your responses. So what do I mean by that? Well, see, like a placebo effect, right? Things like that. So you may be convinced that the thing is bad, and it actually, like, enacts itself as bad for you. That's basically the placebo effect. It's actually nocebo, right? Placebo is when you're convinced that the thing is good, and it actually benefits you through that, right? So you might hypnotize a person and convince them that the candle on a table is lit, and you ask them to put their hand on top of it, and even though the candle wasn't actually lit, so the hand wasn't burned, since the person is convinced it is lit and it's burning, like they would develop a blister on their hand, on their skin. So the body would say, well, if I'm burned, I need to do this response, you know, I need to develop a blister, even though no actual burn has happened. So that's what I'm talking about. So these things like you have an intellectual determinism, if you wish, of there is an intellectual determinism of your reaction to what's just happened, right? So the question is now, can you alter the perception and make it good, for example, if it used to be bad, or vice versa? So here we arrive at the Nietzschean concept of like reevaluation of values, right? Can we like switch at least our intellectual perception of things from one to the other? And here I think Nietzscheanity is very similar to existentialism, right? Where Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, said that a man is condemned to be free, right? What does that mean? Is that like you have to make a choice anyway. Like even if free will doesn't exist, like you act as if it did, right? So even if the choice is to abstain from choice in the first place, it's still a choice. And even if it's pre-programmed by all of these deterministic factors, by your genes or environment or whatever, like it's still a choice, right? Again, as Nietzsche himself said, like, if you consider that free will exists, like actually, you are stupid, but if you feel like it doesn't, you're a madman, right? So it looks as if it existed, but factually, like if you study it on a large scale, it doesn't, right? Something like that. So, and even though the reevaluation of values itself seems like an act of freedom, it may also be programmed, right? We come at this meta level of meta-determinism where you try to change your programming, but even your attempt at changing your own programming is programmed, right? Something like that. So any act of free will may be described as pre-programmed. So in one of my older videos, I have a segment where I talk about like how characters are described in, let's say, theatrical pieces or any other literary pieces. I don't remember which video was that, but there I talk about how even if the character makes like seemingly random choices in a piece, like the author has to introduce the character as someone who makes random choices, right? So it's like they have to pre-program this sort of trickster part into the character from the very get-go, right? So this is also programmed behavior, making chaotic choices, right? Yeah. So even then you may make claims why exactly this choice was made. Well, it's because the character is such that they make random choices, something like that. That's why like there is a saying again in Russian that it could have been Shakespeare actually, aka Francis Bacon, so that the theatrical plays are like the engineering of the souls, right? So we program the characters, we program their souls to behave in a certain way, or something to that effect. Alright, so in this video we talked about the dilemma of the researcher. That is, you may take an activist stance or you may take a researcher stance proper. Like you may prescribe or you may describe. Where in the first option, like both of them are morally ambiguous at the very least, right? So in the first option, you're blaming people for like not following your idea but choosing some other idea instead. But at least you're like acknowledging their humanity, like you perceive them as free human beings capable of making decisions for themselves. You're just not happy with the decisions they're making. And in the other option, you just describe them as automations, as like completely deterministic machines. So you dehumanize them, but at the same time, you're not blaming them, right? So there you go. There's the researcher's dilemma for you. Which one are you gonna choose? Again, I'm not gonna prescribe anything for you. I'm just acting actually as a descriptor for the purposes of this video. Alright, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.